When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, few people were as quick to side with Moscow as Belarusian leader Aleksandr Lukashenko. For years, he had walked a careful line between East and West. But when the moment came, he chose to throw his lot in entirely with Vladimir Putin. His calculations seemed simple. Ukraine would crumble within weeks. Russia would emerge victorious, and Belarus would be rewarded for its loyalty. That, of course, didn't happen. Ukraine resisted. The war dragged on, and the costs of Lukashenko's gamble have steadily piled up. Instead of reaping benefits, Belarus finds itself in the most dangerous position it has faced since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Its economy is tied hand and foot to Russia, its sovereignty is slipping away, and its people are starting to feel the daily pain of a war they never asked for. For decades before this, Lukashenko had been known as a political survivor. He managed to keep power through rigged elections, a heavy hand against dissent. And most of all, his ability to play Russia and the West against one another. He promised Moscow loyalty, but dangled small reforms toward Europe. This balancing act kept Belarus isolated but not completely captured, authoritarian but still somewhat independent. The Ukraine war shattered that balancing act. Belarus opened its territory to Russian troops for the initial assault on Kyiv, allowed its skies to be used for missile strikes, and later even agreed to host Russian nuclear weapons. For Lukashenko, it was supposed to be a winning move. Once Ukraine collapsed, he could claim victory alongside Putin and solidify his grip at home. Instead, Belarus became an accomplice in a quagmire. The fallout was immediate. Western sanctions meant for Russia hit Belarus as well. In 2022, Belarus's economy contracted by nearly 5%. Inflation rose, industry slowed, and foreign investment all but disappeared. By tying himself so closely to Moscow, Lukashenko ensured that whatever happened to Russia would also happen to Belarus. And yet, for a brief moment, things seemed to improve. In 2023 and 2024, as Russia funneled cash into its war industry, Belarus became a supplier of weapons, machinery, and parts. That demand fueled a sudden recovery. Belarus's economy grew by around 4% in both years, providing Lukashenko with a temporary sense of vindication. He could point to growth and say the gamble was working. But beneath that surface recovery, the foundations were rotting. Belarus was no longer standing on its own. Its growth came almost entirely from Russian war spending. Its industries were shaped to serve Moscow's needs. The result was a Soviet-style economic dependency. Belarus became a feeder state, its future bound to Russia's fortunes. By 2025, the cracks were undeniable. Inflation surged. Job vacancies went unfilled as young workers fled abroad. And then came the symbol of the crisis. Potatoes. Long a staple of the Belarusian diets. So important they are often called the country's second bread. Potatoes suddenly became scarce. Lukashenko's strict price controls made potato farming unprofitable, and farmers switched to other crops. Production dropped sharply, creating shortages and anger among ordinary Belarusians. The government's response was clumsy and authoritarian. Lukashenko lashed out at his ministers, accusing them of incompetence, demanding storage facilities be filled to the ceiling, and even encouraging citizens to report shops that violated price rules. But no amount of shouting could hide the reality. Belarus was facing the consequences of its economic mismanagement and dependence. The crisis deepened in August 2025, when Ukrainian drones struck the Druzhba oil pipeline. This key artery carries Russian crude into Belarus, where it is refined into fuel. The strikes cut the flow, fuel prices shot up, and long lines formed at gas stations. Farmers, already struggling, couldn't get the fuel they needed to run their equipment. In that moment, many Belarusians assumed Russia would step in to help its closest ally. Instead, Moscow made matters worse. Russian companies began buying up Belarus's limited supplies to fill their own shortages. Belarus, desperate to protect its domestic market, was forced to restrict sales to Russia. For ordinary Belarusians, the message was clear. Moscow would always serve itself first, no matter what promises of alliance had been made. This was more than an economic betrayal. It was a sign of how far Belarus had fallen. Once an independent if authoritarian state, it was now little more than a vassal. unable to act without considering what Putin wanted. And Russia's actions made it clear that Belarus's sovereignty was little more than a technicality. The military situation reinforced that reality. In September 2025, Belarus hosted the joint Z-Pod exercises with Russia. On paper, they involved about 10,000 Belarusian troops and 4,000 Russians. But unlike earlier drills, these weren't about projecting strength against NATO. They were about normalizing Russia's permanent presence inside Belarus, as one former intelligence officer put it. Belarus is being absorbed into Russia not through a dramatic invasion, but slowly by routine military integration. This process has been underway for decades. As early as 2000, Moscow extended its nuclear umbrella to cover Belarus. Since then, military ties have deepened year by year: joint commands, shared bases, missile deployments. By August 2025, Russia announced it would station its new hypersonic Oreshnik missiles in Belarus. A clear sign that the Kremlin views the country not as an ally, but as part of its own military space. And yet, Lukashenko resists the idea that he is merely Putin's puppet. Analysts note that he has always tried to carve out some room for maneuver. At times, he leans heavily on Moscow. At others, he flirts with the West. Recently, he has begun hinting at a new balancing act. By limiting oil exports to Russia, considering the release of political prisoners, and opening channels to Western officials, he appears to be searching for leverage outside Moscow's grip, but this comes with risks. Putin has little tolerance for disobedience, and Belarus's economy is too fragile to survive without Russian support. Every move Lukashenko makes toward the West risks retaliation from Moscow. Yet staying fully aligned with Russia guarantees deeper dependency and the loss of sovereignty. This is the paradox Belarus faces in 2025. It is trapped between a Russia that treats it as a province and a West that distrusts it after years of complicity in the war. Meanwhile, its people suffer from inflation, shortages, and a collapsing quality of life. The real danger is that the country may implode altogether. Analysts warn that Belarus could lose its independence entirely, absorbed into the Russian Federation in everything but name. What was once a balancing act is now a noose tightening around the country's neck. So the question remains, can Lukashenko find a way to restore Belarus's independence? Or has he already given away too much? His attempt to reopen dialogue with the West may be too little too late. Putin has shown that he will not hesitate to sacrifice Belarus's interests for his own. As Belarus teeters, Putin is already turning to other partners to sustain his war effort. One of them is Turkey, a country walking its own tightrope between NATO and Russia. The Kremlin is now asking Ankara for advanced air defenses to replace what it has lost in Ukraine. What happens next in this dangerous game of alliances could reshape the balance of power in Europe. And that is a story we'll explore in our next video.